What compelled the most hardened and pragmatic outlaws and scoundrels of the 16th century, men who had personally plundered the treasuries of the Incas and Aztecs, to repeatedly embark on utterly insane quests for a phantom? The answer that seems obvious is insatiable greed. But that's only part of the truth, a convenient smokescreen concealing a far more terrifying and cynical mechanism. The story of El Dorado isn't some swashbuckling adventure novel about a treasure hunt. It's a dark political thriller about how one of humanity's greatest legends was weaponized. I invite you to become my accomplice in this investigation, to together crack the code of this mass hysteria and understand how the dream of a golden city morphed into a one-way ticket to a verdant hell from which there was no return. Let's momentarily transport ourselves to Cartagena or Santa Marta in the mid-16th century. Take a breath. The air here is a thick, humid cocktail, a blend of the tang of the salty sea, the decay of tropical fruits rotting on the docks, the acrid sweat of thousands of unwashed bodies and animals, the sour wine from the taverns, and the sharp char of corn roasting over open fires. Listen closely. This isn't just the din of a port city. It's the clang of a blacksmith's hammer forging a horseshoe or mending a cuirass. It's guttural shouts in dozens of Castilian, Andalusian, and Extremaduran dialects. It's the whinnying of hundreds of horses and the stubborn bray of mules, the backbone of all logistics in this harsh new world. It's the sonic score of an era, every sound hinting at preparation for a leap into the unknown. Who are these individuals preparing for the expedition? Forget the noble hidalgos depicted in Velázquez's paintings. What stands before us is human material forged in the crucible of Europe's bloodiest wars. These are veterans of the Battle of Pavia, the sack of Rome, and the endless wars in Flanders. Many are younger sons of impoverished gentry, left without an inch of land by the laws of primogeniture. Others are commoners fleeing famine, or criminals offered a choice: the gallows in Seville or a one-way ticket to the New World. Their faces are leathered by wind and tropical sun, scarred by smallpox and arquebus balls. They are pragmatic, ruthless, and deadly dangerous because they have nothing to lose. To grasp their psychology, we must crack two key cultural codes woven into their consciousness. The first code is oro y fama, gold and glory. Gold was more than mere wealth. In the rigidly stratified class system of 16th century Spain, it offered the sole path for social mobility. A peasant who struck gold in the New World could return home a don, purchase land, a coat of arms, and marry his daughter to a nobleman. This was an absolute inconceivable transformation. But glory, fama, was no less crucial. To be a hero whose exploits would be immortalized in ballads like the legendary El Cid, that's what truly drove these men. They risked their lives not just for a sack of pesos, but for a line in the chronicles of history. The second, and perhaps paramount code, was the Reconquista mentality. For nearly 800 years, their ancestors had been reclaiming the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors. This centuries-long war spawned a unique type of warrior crusader, for whom killing an infidel and seizing their lands was not a sin, but a sacred duty, a God-pleasing endeavor. Their battle cry, Santiago y a ellos, St. James and at them, was more than just a call to attack. It was a prayer and an indulgence all rolled into one. Crossing the ocean, they simply continued their Reconquista, transplanting it to a new land and new heathens. They did not view the indigenous peoples as fully human, and their civilizations merely an irksome obstacle on the path to gold and glory in the name of the Spanish crown and the Catholic faith. And this entire grand project of conquest was, at its core, the boldest and most immoral startup in human history. The Spanish crown acted as a venture capital fund that didn't invest its own money, but granted a license to develop new lands, demanding in return 20% of all profits, the famous Royal Fifth. Expedition leaders like Pizarro or De Soto were ruthless CEOs who personally sought out private investors to finance ships and equipment. and the rank-and-file conquistadors were employees working not for a salary, but for a share of the future spoils, a kind of stock option that could make them fabulously rich or leave them to rot in the swamps. This mechanism, where every participant was a shareholder in the enterprise and personally invested in its bloody success, became the engine that conquered two vast empires with incredible speed and brutality. But once the empires fell and the gold was divided, thousands of these armed, avaricious, and utterly useless shareholders in peacetime became an enormous problem for the colonial administration itself. They had to be put somewhere. And that's when a truly brilliant, cynical idea was born. The idea of a city made of pure gold. The Aztec and Inca empires had fallen. Their gold, melted down into anonymous ingots, had already crossed the ocean to fund the Spanish king's European wars. A vacuum emerged in the New World colonies. Thousands of conquistadors, men whose only trades were war and plunder, suddenly found themselves idle. The euphoria of victory gave way to dangerous boredom. In Lima, Cusco, and Bogotá, they gambled away their shares of the spoils, brawling over dice and slicing each other with blades over the slightest insult. These men were living gunpowder, and colonial authorities realized with horror that if their energy wasn't directed outward, it would explode from within the fragile peace built on the ruins of other civilizations. The problem demanded not just a solution, but a stroke of genius. And this move didn't come from the Viceroy's office, but from the depths of the continent, in the form of fragmented rumors. At first, they were vague tales from captured members of various tribes. They spoke of a powerful people living high in the mountains, in a land of salt and emeralds. They spoke of a strange ritual performed during the coronation of a new ruler. The accounts were hazy, but one phrase recurred constantly, making the Spanish lean in to listen: the Golden Man. In reality, these rumors described a very specific ritual of the Muisca people who lived on the high plateau of modern-day Colombia. When a new chief, or Zipa, was elected, his body would be covered from head to toe in sticky resin, then dusted with the finest gold powder. He would transform into a living statue of pure gold. In this form, he would be seated on a richly adorned raft, and accompanied by 4 other chiefs, paddle out to the center of the sacred lake Guatavita. There, under the rays of the rising sun, he would make offerings to the gods, casting precious gold artifacts and emeralds into the dark water. Then, he himself would dive into the lake, washing the gold dust from his body. This was an act of purification and consecration, a sacred ritual affirming the ruler's connection to the divine world. But in the inflamed imagination of the conquistadors, this story underwent a monstrous metamorphosis. Through countless retellings from one company to another, amidst the smoke of campfires and the fumes of cheap wine, details were distorted and exaggerated. The ritual became an everyday occurrence. The gold-covered chief became a king who covered himself in gold every morning and washed it off every evening. The lake full of treasures ballooned into an entire city. El Dorado, meaning the Gilded One, ceased to be a person's name and became the name of a place. Thus was born the legend of the city of Manoa, where houses were adorned with golden plates, streets were paved with golden cobblestones, and treasures lay underfoot like common pebbles. And this is where the idea transformed into a weapon. Spanish governors and captains, the most perceptive and cynical among them, quickly understood the incredible tool that had fallen into their hands. This myth was the perfect solution to their biggest problem. It was credible enough for men who had seen the treasures of Cusco with their own eyes to believe it. It pointed in the only correct direction, deep into the unknown, wild lands to the east, into the endless jungles and swamps of the Amazon and Orinoco basins. It was an ideal magnet, capable of drawing all the restless, avaricious, and unruly veterans out of the flourishing colonies. The reaction surpassed all expectations. It didn't just create a bombshell effect. It became a new religion. The myth of El Dorado landed on perfectly prepared soil. For thousands of conquistadors who had squandered their share or arrived too late for the main spoils, this was a second chance, a last chance. They didn't doubt the existence of a golden city for a single second. If Tenochtitlan and Cusco existed in this wild world, then why not a third, even richer city? Yesterday's conspirators, ready to rebel against the governor, became loyal soldiers of a new leader who promised to guide them to El Dorado. People mortgaged their homes and estates, buying rusty armor and lame horses at exorbitant prices. Blacksmiths worked day and night, forging swords and spearheads. Priests blessed expeditions, heading out in search of a phantom. The legend ceased to be just a rumor. It transformed into a material force that mobilized armies and led them to certain death. The trap had sprung. To understand how this deadly mechanism worked, we must abandon conventional imagery. A conquistador expedition into the Amazonian jungle was not an army in the classical sense. It had no rear, no supply lines, no bases. It was a predatory, nomadic, self-sufficient organism that bit into a hostile environment with one singular objective: to move forward until it found its prey or died of exhaustion. And its design was simultaneously brilliant and monstrous, because it was engineered to feed not only on its surroundings, but on itself. Everything began with the formation of this organism. A call was announced in the colonial city. The future leader, the Adelantado, having received a royal license, would unfurl a banner and read out a decree. A miniature gold rush would ensue. All who craved wealth flocked to him: veterans, newcomers from Spain, adventurers, debtors. Every participant was an investor. Those with a horse and armor contributed them. Those with nothing but a sword and courage contributed their lives, signing up for a share of the future spoils. This principle of sociedad, or company, transformed the expedition not into a disciplined army, but into an armed joint stock company where everyone had a voice and everyone was ready to slit a partner's throat for an extra piece of gold. Let's look under the hood of this monster. Its brain was the Adelantado himself, a charismatic, ruthless, and utterly self-confident leader. Its nervous system comprised his captains, seasoned veterans responsible for reconnaissance, discipline, and defense. The steel skeleton and fangs were the small cavalry, between 30 and 100 horsemen encased in armor. One such 16th century tank could send 1,000 indigenous people who had never seen horses fleeing. The muscles were the infantry, arquebusiers with primitive firearms, crossbowmen, and the main mass, swordsmen with rodela, a round shield, masters of close combat. And the digestive and circulatory system, without which all this iron would be useless, was the huge throng of indigenous porters, servants, and guides called Yanaconas. It was they who carried on their backs provisions, gunpowder, horseshoes, tools, and even the captain's personal belongings. They were the most expendable and the most vital element of the system. Now, let's visualize the process step by step. Step 1. The departure. What emerged from the city gates wasn't a disciplined column, but a clanking, roaring gypsy caravan. Hundreds of soldiers, thousands of indigenous porters, herds of pigs and llamas for provisions, packs of war dogs trained to tear human flesh. Ahead, scouts hacked paths with machetes. In the center, the cavalry and captains. Bringing up the rear guard fended off hostile tribes perpetually dogging their heels. This nomadic city plunged into the green ocean of the jungle for several months. Step 2. The march of attrition. Each day morphed into a hellish routine. 8 to 10 hours of slogging through knee-deep mud under constant assault from mosquitoes and snakes. Soldiers in rusting armor suffered from the heat and humidity. Arquebuses and gunpowder grew damp. Food began to rot. Slowly, but inevitably, the organism began to weaken. The indigenous porters were the first to die, succumbing to unbearable labor, disease, and starvation. Their deaths meant that soldiers had to abandon some equipment or carry it themselves. Step 3. Systemic cannibalism. This is where the full engineering horror of this mechanism revealed itself. When the provisions taken from the city ran out and no indigenous village with maize stores could be captured, the system began to devour itself. First, the pigs were eaten. Then, the war dogs. Then, and this was a dreadful step, they began to slaughter the horses, the conquistador's most valuable weapon. When even these were gone, leather belts, shields, and sandals went into the pot. Simultaneously, social cannibalism unfolded. The sick and wounded were simply left to die on the trail. Disgruntled and doubting individuals were hanged from the nearest tree to intimidate the rest. The adelantado, like a surgeon, amputated the weakened parts of the organism so that the core could press onward. All this time, while people gnawed on boiled leather and succumbed to fevers, the system's mastermind, its leader, continued to sustain a dying body with the only narcotic at his disposal, the legends of El Dorado. He endlessly chanted that the Golden City was just beyond the next river over that mountain range. Scouts returned with encouraging news. Captives under torture confirmed that Manoa was just a stone's throw away. This vital deception was the fuel that propelled the expedition forward, even as it dwindled to a bloody skeleton of its former self. We speak of hundreds of conquistadors, but who were they? Let's momentarily set aside the leaders and cast our gaze upon the humble soldier, a Juan from Extremadura, for instance. Over a single expedition, which might stretch for 1 or 2 years, he would trek, hacking his way through dense jungle, a distance equivalent to traveling from Madrid to Moscow. He carried his sword, perhaps a breastplate, slept in the muck, and battled fevers and dysentery. Over the course of the trek, he'd lose 1/3 of his body weight, his clothes would fray into rags, and his skin would erupt in sores. And all for no pay, but for a phantom share of spoils that existed only in his commander's mind. The grandeur and sheer madness of this era aren't etched in mythical treasure maps, but in the calluses on that nameless soldier's feet. Behind the scenes of every such expedition stood figures whose names rarely grace the chronicles, yet without whom this entire bloody spectacle simply couldn't have unfolded. One key figure was the priest. We're accustomed to envisioning him as a spiritual shepherd, but in the crucible of these journeys into the unknown, his roles were far more pragmatic and sinister. He served as the venture's lawyer and notary. It was he who compiled the lists of participants and their shares. And it was he who, before every desolate river or forest clearing, would read aloud the so-called requirement or requerimiento, a legal document formally offering invisible indigenous peoples the chance to submit to the Spanish crown. This was an act of bureaucratic absurdity, transforming the subsequent slaughter into a legitimate war. Moreover, the priest was the expedition's chief ideologue and propagandist. When despair and starvation began to decimate the ranks, when soldiers realized they were being led to oblivion, it was he who stepped forward. In his sermons, he spoke not of mercy, but of these sufferings as a trial sent by God. He declared that El Dorado was a new Jerusalem, promised only to the most steadfast. He was the one who maintained the tension of the lie, cloaking a cynical gamble in the form of a sacred crusade. He didn't merely absolve sins, he legitimized them, transforming a band of ruthless cutthroats into an army of Christ. Another less obvious, yet vitally important figure was the indigenous guide, known as a Baquiano. Most often, this was a captive from a local tribe whose life was spared in exchange for a promise to show the way. His plight was utterly tragic. He marched in chains at the vanguard of the company, his life hanging by a thread every single second. If he led the Spanish into a swamp or toward a hostile village, he was instantly accused of treachery and fed to the war dogs. Conversely, if to save his own life, he guided them to the settlements of his own people, he bore witness to their annihilation and became a cursed traitor in the eyes of his tribe. These nameless guides were living maps, discarded as soon as their utility ran out. Yet, perhaps nothing grounds the tale of El Dorado more than a shocking everyday detail typically omitted from heroic sagas. The conquistador's primary foe in the jungle was not the jaguar nor the poisoned arrow, but a minuscule insect, the sand flea, known as nigua or chigoe flea. This creature, less than 1 millimeter long, would burrow under toenails or into cracks in the heels and lay an egg sac beneath the skin, which would swell to the size of a pea. This caused excruciating itching and pain. The only way to remove the parasite was to cut out the sac with a knife. In the unsanitary conditions of the expedition, this almost invariably led to infection, gangrene, and amputation. Dozens of hardened veterans who feared no confrontation with hundreds of indigenous warriors were incapacitated by this invisible torment. It is in these specific details, the priest's bureaucratic role, the guide's tragedy, and the agony of rotting feet, that the true story of these expeditions lies. This wasn't merely a chase for gold, it was a slow, methodical process of dehumanization. Hunger, disease, fear, and the commander's perpetual lies blurred the line between civilized man and beast. The leaders saw perfectly well their men literally rotting alive. They watched faith transform into despair and despair into quiet madness. But the mechanism was set in motion, and stopping it was no longer an option. Each new day spent in that green hell made returning pointless. Too much had been invested, too much distance covered. All that remained was to push onward, into the very heart of the myth that was simultaneously their sole hope and their death sentence. The system ran like clockwork. Expedition after expedition, packed with the most desperate and unruly scoundrels, vanished into the jungles without a trace. In 1560, another detachment, under the command of the noble but naive Navarrese Pedro de Ursua, set off down the Amazon River. Aboard his brigantines were about 300 Spaniards, several dozen black slaves, and thousands of indigenous porters. The goal, as always, was El Dorado. For the colonial authorities, this was just another disposal trip for human refuse. But they overlooked one crucial factor. In the hold of one of those ships, among hundreds of others, sailed a man in whom the gold fever virus had mutated into something far more terrifying. His name was Lope de Aguirre. The perfect storm didn't begin externally, it brewed within. Months passed, and still no golden city appeared. Instead, there was only an endless green wall, putrid water, fever, and starvation. The soldiers, just as predicted, began to grumble. Faith in their leader, Pedro de Ursua, eroded with each passing day. And in this atmosphere of decaying hope, Lope de Aguirre, an unremarkable limping veteran with eyes ablaze with madness, began to weave his web. He didn't advocate turning back. He proposed something unheard of. He began to whisper what everyone secretly thought. The king is far away, and God is high above. Why should we seek treasures for a crown that abandoned us here to die? It was precisely here that the brilliant system faltered. The very cohesion of the expedition, built on a shared blind faith in the myth and personal loyalty to the leader, turned against itself. The system's strength lay in providing people with one common, all-consuming goal: El Dorado. But Aguirre didn't destroy this goal. He perverted it. He told them, yes, El Dorado exists, but when we find it, it won't belong to King Philip. It will belong to us. We will create our own kingdom here, free from taxes and officials. I will lead you not to gold, I will lead you to freedom. This was the stroke of genius from a madman. He took the system's primary narcotic, greed, and blended it with an even more potent poison, the idea of rebellion. He appealed to the deep-seated sense of injustice that lived in every conquistador who risked his life only to hand over 1/5, the best part of the spoils, to a faceless crown across the ocean. The lie of El Dorado, crafted to control these men, became the fuel for their liberation from that very control. New Year's Eve, 1561, marked the point of no return. The rebels stormed Pedro de Ursua's hut and stabbed him to death. Command passed to Aguirre's puppet, whom he would also soon kill. But Aguirre did more than just seize power. He gathered all the surviving soldiers and compelled them to sign a document declaring them independent from Spain and proclaiming their new leader the Prince of Peru. He made every man an accomplice to high treason. He burned all bridges behind them. Now, they were no longer mere adventurers. They were pirates, traitors, enemies of the world's most powerful empire. And it was here that the cynical plan of the authorities failed with a resounding crash. Instead of silently perishing in the swamps, the detachment transformed into a floating army of marauders, a cancerous growth that didn't dissipate but began to move, bringing chaos in its wake. They no longer sought El Dorado. They became El Dorado, brutal, bloody, and utterly unpredictable. The expedition, intended as a death march, became a march of the damned. They sailed on their half-rotted vessels along the world's greatest river, surrounded by thousands of square miles of untamed jungle. They were utterly alone in the universe, without hope of aid or forgiveness. Their only law was the whim of a mad tyrant who, every day, executed his former comrades at the slightest suspicion. And above it all, above the murmuring of the fever-stricken and the creak of oarlocks, hung one single, unanswerable question. What does an army of traitors, having declared war on the entire world, do when it finds itself in the absolute middle of nowhere? Historians have debated the nature of Lope de Aguirre's madness for decades. The classic version posits that he was simply a psychopath whose innate cruelty and paranoia blossomed like a venomous flower in the extreme conditions of the jungle. According to this theory, his rebellion was an irrational explosion of pure evil, devoid of any logic beyond the logic of insanity. But what if that's not the case? What if his actions weren't insane, but rather extremely rational, based on one simple and terrifying realization? Modern researchers, such as the hypothetical Dr. Elena Rivas, analyzing circumstantial evidence and rare surviving letters from participants, propose an alternative, far more unsettling theory. Aguirre wasn't the only one who suspected El Dorado was a lie, but he was the first to understand that the truth about this lie could itself become a weapon. He saw how the cynical system used myth to dispose of soldiers, and he decided to flip the board. His rebellion wasn't merely a revolt against the king, it was a rebellion against the matrix itself, against the grand deception upon which all colonial expansion rested. He didn't go mad in the jungle. He found a terrifying, nihilistic clarity within it. Let's examine the economics that led to this explosion. Outfitting one such expedition was a colossal undertaking. The costs for purchasing ships, horses, weapons, gunpowder, and provisions for months of travel were comparable to funding a minor war or constructing a new cathedral. These funds were raised by private investors who, in essence, bought shares in this deadly, dangerous joint stock company. The leader himself, Pedro de Ursua, incurred enormous debts to launch his startup. But the true currency of this economy wasn't measured in pesos. It was measured in human lives, and not Spanish ones. Thousands of indigenous porters, rounded up from their lands, were not hired laborers. They were living, disposable fuel for this machine. Their names weren't on the shareholders' lists. Their deaths weren't reflected in financial reports. When one porter collapsed from exhaustion, he was simply dragged into the bushes, and the column was driven onward. This ruthless economy, built on the devaluation of human life, was inevitably destined to produce a monster who would apply the same principles to his creators. And in this light, Aguirre's rebellion takes on a terrifying symbolism. When he forced his men to sign the document renouncing King Philip, it wasn't merely a political act. In the 16th century world, where the monarch's power was considered divine, this was tantamount to renouncing God. It was an act of metaphysical rebellion. Aguirre wasn't just burning a political bridge, he was attempting to detonate the very foundations of his cosmos. His famous words in a letter to the king, "I, a rebel unto death because of your ingratitude," are not the words of a madman. They are the manifesto of a man who realized he was bankrupt within a system where all bets were placed on lies, and who decided to drag the system itself, along with all its players, down to hell with him. His subsequent path of terror down the Amazon and into the Atlantic Ocean was not simply an escape. It was a business model taken to an absurd extreme. Failing to find mythical gold, he began to acquire real gold by plundering Spanish settlements, killing officials, and seizing ships. He transformed a failed search and discovery startup into a bloody, piratical, hostile takeover. He demonstrated that if the system deceives you, the most rational response is to become an even more ruthless predator than the system itself. And now, having trekked through the crimson trail of these expeditions, having overheard the conspirators' whispers in Ursua's camp, having felt the bite of mosquitoes and the gnawing despair of a starving soldier, the pieces of the puzzle begin to coalesce into a single, terrifying tapestry. We've seen the cynical calculus of colonial authorities who needed a tidy way to dispose of undesirables. We've understood the conquistador's psychology, for whom gold and glory were the only gospel. We've dissected the very machinery of the expedition, that predatory, self-devouring organism engineered to survive hell itself. And we've borne witness as this machine, once in the grip of the mad genius Lope de Aguirre, mutated and turned on its own creators. All these threads converge on a single point, the unraveling of a central paradox. So what, then, is the ultimate secret of the El Dorado phenomenon? It was never a tale about the search for a golden city. It was the story of a brilliantly engineered human disposal system, fueled by their own avarice and powered by the era's greatest myth. El Dorado was not a location on a map. It was a vortex, a black hole on the mental landscape of the 16th century, designed to swallow up and utterly erase the most dangerous and driven human material of its time. Consider the sheer scale of this social engineering. Colonial authorities didn't have to build prisons for thousands of hardened veteran cutthroats. They didn't need to risk civil war by attempting to disarm the very men who had just conquered a continent for them. They found a far more elegant solution. They created a dream so alluring and plausible that the most dangerous men of their age voluntarily formed companies, financed themselves, and marched off singing to their deaths in impassable swamps, thousands of miles from any center of civilization. It was the perfect trap because it required no overseers. Each participant in the expedition was simultaneously prisoner and jailer for himself and his comrades. They were driven forward not by the whip of a taskmaster, but by hope. Their discipline wasn't enforced by regulations, but by the fear of missing out on their share of the treasure that awaited them just around the next bend in the river. The system was so ingeniously perfect that it compelled its victims to enthusiastically fund and organize their own demise. This is precisely why expeditions continued again and again, even after dozens of failures. Each failure didn't disprove the myth, it only strengthened it. If Gonzalo Pizarro's company returned empty-handed, it simply meant they hadn't looked in the right place. If Philip von Hutten's expedition was annihilated, it implied they weren't strong enough to reach the objective. The legend of El Dorado was immune to reality. It fed not on evidence, but on its absence. The fewer the facts, the more room there was for faith. Lope de Aguirre didn't break this system. He merely pushed its logic to its absolute, nightmarish extreme. He was the virus that revealed the true nature of its host. If a system is built on total falsehood and uses people as disposable resources in pursuit of an illusory goal, then the most logical product of that system is a man who embodies that total falsehood, proclaims himself a god, and begins to use everyone around him as disposable resources for his own, utterly real objectives. Aguirre was not a glitch in the program. He was its inevitable outcome. And when you view it from such a height, you realize that what lies before you is not merely a succession of tragic adventures. It's a cold, calculated mechanism where the primary technology isn't the arquebus or the steel sword, but the managed dream. The story of El Dorado stands as a grim monument to the human mind's capacity to conjure ideas that prove deadlier than any weapon. This was no longer just about politics or war. This was a design of titanic, almost diabolical scale, in which grand hope was transmuted into the most effective poison, and the paradisiacal jungles of South America became the perfect proving ground for its application. This isn't a story about people seeking gold, but about an idea hunting people. And that hunt was incredibly successful. It might seem that a history built on lies and culminating in the deaths of thousands in nameless swamps could leave no legacy beyond a bloody stain in history textbooks. But that's not true. The repercussions of the El Dorado myth proved far more sweeping and enduring than the myth itself. An unforeseen domino effect was triggered, forever changing the world map. Setting out in search of a mythical city, the conquistadors unwittingly made some of the greatest geographical discoveries. Francisco de Orellana, a captain in Gonzalo Pizarro's ill-fated expedition trying to escape starvation, built boats with his company and simply drifted down an unknown river. This river turned out to be the Amazon. His desperate flight became the first journey by Europeans along the entire length of the planet's greatest river. Thus, ironically, the pursuit of a phantom led to the discovery and initial mapping of the colossal river systems of the Amazon and Orinoco, charting millions of square miles of previously blank space. But this domino had a dark, inverse side. Every step taken by these explorers was also a conqueror's stride. Their routes, traced on maps, were in reality laid across the bodies and burned villages of dozens of indigenous peoples, many of whom were seeing a white man for the first time. Contact with these expeditions meant one of two things for them: swift death by sword and arquebus, or a slow one from European diseases to which they had no immunity. The path to El Dorado became the path of spreading death. The very maps that formed the basis of the future colonial borders of Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela, and Peru were drawn with charcoal dipped in blood. And what remains in our culture? Here, the myth's legacy has proven astonishingly resilient. First, the word itself. El Dorado has entered almost every language in the world as a synonym for untold wealth, paradise on earth, the ultimate goal of any quest. We see it in the names of casinos, hotels, shopping malls, and video games. It has become part of our global lexicon, completely detached from its grim and bloody origins. We utter this word without considering that for thousands of people, it signified not a dream, but a death sentence. Second, El Dorado spawned an entire genre. All modern adventure literature and cinema, from King Solomon's Mines to Indiana Jones and Lara Croft, sprang from this myth. The narrative code remains unchanged. An ancient map, a brave hero, a deadly journey deep into wild jungles in search of a lost city and its treasures. El Dorado created the archetype of the green hell, which simultaneously beckons with immense riches and threatens certain doom. This cultural virus proved so potent that we still eagerly consume its metastases, mistaking them for pure entertainment. But the main paradox of El Dorado's legacy lies in how the original idea eventually transformed into its complete opposite. Let's remember, the myth was crafted as a tool of containment, a black hole for disposing of the most dangerous elements of colonial society. Its purpose was to draw in and destroy, preventing them from spreading and threatening established order. Yet, what did it ultimately become? the primary engine of expansion. It was the chase for El Dorado, not any coherent plan for colonization, that drove the Spanish, Germans, and English deeper and deeper into the heart of the continent. The myth, which was meant to be a dead end, transformed into the main road leading into the unknown. It was the irrational fuel that drove people to do what no sane politician or economist would ever have dared. Thus, a tool designed to conserve the empire's borders became the primary instrument of their explosive expansion. A trap for humans evolved into a battering ram, clearing a path for European civilization into the most remote corners of South America. And in this sinister transformation lies the paramount, enduring legacy of the Golden Phantom. It might seem that the story of bearded men in rusted armor trudging through jungles 500 years ago is ancient history, completely irrelevant to us. But look around. Isn't our world overflowing with its own El Dorados? Financial markets promising instant riches from trading thin air. Political ideologies offering a simple path to universal happiness through hatred of others. Social media platforms where gurus sell the secret to success, neatly packaged in sleek infographics. The technologies have changed. Instead of oral rumors, we have viral posts. Instead of brigantines, digital platforms. But the operating system of the human psyche, its vulnerability to seductive myths, remains the same. We live in an era where the production and dissemination of myths have been industrialized. Every day, tons of information bombard us, designed not to provoke reflection, but an instantaneous emotional reaction, greed, fear, righteous anger. And just like the conquistadors, we voluntarily trap ourselves in information bubbles where any reality contradicting our treasure map is branded as enemy propaganda. This mechanism of self-isolation and self-deception, which operated in Lope de Aguirre's camp, today functions on the scale of entire nations. And here crystallizes the main, non-trivial lesson of this story. It's not simply that greed is bad. That's far too simplistic. The lesson is that the most dangerous prison for a human being isn't walls of stone, but a beautiful, all-encompassing story that they desperately want to believe. The myth of El Dorado was so powerful not because it deceived people, but because it gave their meaningless and brutal lives a grand purpose. It answered their deep-seated craving for meaning, and for the sake of that meaning, they were willing to ignore any, even the most obvious, reality. This story teaches us not cynicism, but intellectual hygiene. It demonstrates that the most crucial virtue in a world saturated with myths is the capacity for critical thinking. The ability to ask uncomfortable questions, not only of leaders, but also, far more challenging, of ourselves. The ability to doubt the very map that promises you everything, especially when everyone around you is shouting that it is the only true one. This is the essential survival skill in today's jungles. The conquistadors perished not so much from hunger and disease as from cognitive distortion. They gazed upon a putrid swamp, but saw a path to gold. They ate boiled leather straps, but mentally parceled out the treasures of Manoa. Their physical death was merely a consequence of their mental blindness. They were dead long before their hearts stopped beating. They died the moment they allowed a dream to completely replace reality. And therein lies El Dorado's profound and unsettling warning for each of us. The world will always offer us simple answers and tempting goals. But before diving headfirst into yet another quest for a promised paradise, it's worth pausing for a moment and soberly asking ourselves, isn't that beautiful map, handed to us with such enthusiasm, merely a one-way ticket to the very heart of the green hell? To grasp the full depth of this tragedy, we must make the most challenging intellectual effort, to leave the conquistadors' camp and view these events through the eyes of those they came to discover. In our minds, shaped by European culture, the Amazonian jungle is a wild, empty place, a green hell. But for the hundreds of peoples who had lived there for thousands of years, it was not hell. It was their home, their world, their universe. This world was not primitive. It was incredibly complex, with an intricate network of riverine trade routes, skilled artisans creating exquisite pottery and hammocks, profound cosmological myths, and sophisticated social structures. For them, the world was a living library of sounds, smells, and signs that they could read with perfect mastery. And then, one day, into this ordered, comprehensible world, something utterly alien invades. Imagine the shock of first contact. From behind the trees emerge creatures unlike anything ever seen before. Pale, like grubs, with hair on their faces, a feature many indigenous peoples considered a mark of an animal, not a human. They are clad in shimmering hard hides that arrows cannot penetrate. They move atop gigantic, never-before-seen beasts that seem one with the rider, like centaurs from a nightmare. And in their hands, they carry sticks that belch smoke, thunder, and death from a distance. In the eyes of the native inhabitants, these were not humans. These were walking specters, demons emerged from the underworld. But the most profound cultural shock didn't stem from their weaponry. It arose from their inexplicable behavior. Their actions defied any discernible logic. They weren't scouting for fertile lands to cultivate maize. They didn't hunt for sustenance. They weren't seeking women to forge new lineages. Their obsession fixated on a singular substance, a soft yellow metal, utterly worthless for practical use. To the indigenous peoples, gold held sacred, not economic significance. It was the very sweat of the sun, a tangible fragment of the divine, meticulously crafted into ritual adornments to commune with ancestral spirits. The notion of hoarding it, smelting it, or stashing it away in coffers was as utterly nonsensical to them as accumulating vast piles of fallen leaves would be to us. This avaricious obsession with gold manifested as a profound form of madness, an alarming spiritual affliction. These newcomers were prepared to torture, murder, and raze entire villages for the sake of a few paltry golden trinkets. They adhered to no sacred rituals of warfare, took no captives for ceremonial sacrifices, and sought no honor in single combat. Their violence was total, senseless, and disquietingly commonplace, as methodical and unremarkable as a lumberjack's toil. They were not warriors, they were a pestilence. And as captives, writhing under torture, repeatedly heard the relentless query, "Where is the gold? Where is the golden city?" They would, in a desperate bid to cease their torment, point in one consistent direction, as far as possible from their homeland, deeper into the continent's impenetrable heart. They weren't lying. They were simply attempting to divert the plague elsewhere. This brings us to the tragic paradox of predictability itself. The diverse peoples of Amazonia were far from defenseless lambs. They were fierce, masterful jungle warriors, adept in the intricate art of guerrilla warfare. They could vanish seamlessly into the forest, unleash barrages of poisoned arrows, and disappear without a trace. Yet, their greatest strength, an intimate knowledge of their world, ultimately turned against them. They were fragmented into hundreds of distinct tribes, frequently embroiled in internecine conflicts over hunting grounds or driven by the inexorable pull of blood feuds. They simply did not conceive of continental alliances. The conquistadors, direct heirs to the Roman maxim of divide and conquer, were diabolically brilliant at pitting one tribe against another, exploiting them as guides, porters, and disposable cannon fodder. But their cardinal vulnerability lay not in their disunity, but in the very fabric of their thought. Their world, their very approach to warfare, was inextricably bound by tradition, ritual, and a profound sense of balance. They simply could not fathom an adversary whose sole objective transcended mere victory, aiming instead for the utter depletion of resources, total pillage, and the ruthless transformation of an entire world into a pure wellspring of profit. Their strengths, their steadfast fidelity to tradition, their profound spiritual connection to the land, their predictable and ritualized way of life, rendered them utterly defenseless against a new paradigm of thought. One that was cold, global, rapacious, and utterly devoid of any sacred boundaries. They didn't lose because they were inherently weaker. They encountered a virulent strain of thought, a conceptual virus against which their civilization possessed no immunity. To an Amazonian indigenous person, the Conquistador was far more than a mere foe. He represented an ontological catastrophe, a living, breathing testament that the world could be structured in an utterly alien manner, not upon the principles of balance and reciprocity, but on the tenets of endless, insatiable consumption. And this terrifying new world marched across their ancestral lands, leaving in its wake not merely corpses, but a scorched, hollowed-out void where an entire universe once thrived. The genius of Lope de Aguirre was the genius of a malignant cell, perfectly mastering only the art of annihilation. Following Ursua's assassination, he shrewdly refrained from seizing sole leadership. Instead, he strategically placed the noble, albeit weak-willed, aristocrat Don Fernando de Guzman at the head of the insurrection. This was a cunning gambit. Guzman served as the rebellion's impressive facade, its legitimate, palatable face. Yet, this veneer of legitimacy would prove ephemeral. Soon, however, Aguirre realized that the very notion of a noble leader, one who appealed to law and honor, was the final, tenuous thread binding his army of the damned to the world they had so utterly renounced. And with a ruthless, decisive stroke, he severed it. His most fateful and agonizing decision involved the execution of his own puppet, the noble Guzman. This wasn't merely the elimination of a rival, it was a ritualistic act. By murdering the aristocratic figurehead, Aguirre annihilated the very concept of hierarchy and noble lineage upon which Spain itself was built. The ramifications were horrifying and irreversible. The rebellion shed its final vestiges of political purpose, devolving into pure terror, a one-man show where everyone else became mere hostages to his deranged will. From that moment forward, the only law aboard this floating hell was the capricious whim of its mad creator. It is precisely here that we gain a chilling glimpse into his inner world. The burden of absolute power, coupled with absolute isolation, transformed the pragmatic, cynical mutineer into a messianic tyrant. Paranoia became the very air he breathed, the lens through which he perceived the entire world. He was a king on a throne of rotting planks, adrift on an endless river in the very heart of nowhere. He could trust no one, for every single one of his comrades was as much a perjurer as he was. Every whisper sounded like a conspiracy, every sideways glance a betrayal. And the sole method of maintaining control over this nest of vipers was to relentlessly lop off head after head after head. His reign morphed into a conveyor belt of death. Each day began with interrogations and torture. Yesterday's captains and closest confidants confessed to treason and were immediately strung up from the yardarms or hacked into pieces. Aguirre forced everyone else to witness these executions, transforming them into gruesome cautionary spectacles. His expedition began to cannibalize itself with astonishing speed. Fear became the singular fuel propelling this macabre arc forward. Aguirre was no longer warring against the Spanish crown. He was battling human nature itself, attempting to sear out, with a red-hot iron, any notions of friendship, loyalty, or mercy from his crew. But it wasn't only the blood of his soldiers that was sacrificed on the altar of this insane ambition. The most horrific victim was his own daughter, Elvira. A mere girl whom he had brought along on this expedition, she was his last living reminder that he had once been not just a soldier, but a father. She was the silent witness to his transformation into a monster, the only being whose presence could still, theoretically, humanize him. When, after a long and bloody journey across rivers and ocean, Aguirre's contingent was finally surrounded by royal forces on the Venezuelan coast, he understood that all was lost. His men, utterly exhausted by his tyranny, were prepared to betray him at any second. And in that pivotal moment, he committed his final, most monstrous act. He entered the hut where his daughter was hiding and stabbed her with a dagger. His soldiers would later recount his final words to his daughter before her murder. "I kill you so that the hand of the enemy cannot dishonor you, and so that you do not become a harlot for traitors or bear the shameful name of a traitor's daughter." In that single sentence lies the entire essence of his tragedy. In his twisted logic, murder became the ultimate act of paternal love and protection. To save his daughter from shame, he had to destroy her. It was the final dissonant chord in his war against the entire cosmos. The price of his total nihilistic freedom proved absolute, the annihilation of the only person he might have truly loved. He began with a rebellion fueled by gold and glory, and he ended by murdering his own child to spare her from the consequences of his own heinous deeds. When we envision a melting pot, we typically imagine a peaceful process, a harmonious blending of cultures creating something new and beautiful. But what unfolded in the New World was no melting pot. It was the epicenter of a tectonic collision between two continents of consciousness, a process that was brutal, agonizing, and consumed by fire. Picture a quintessential scene. A Spanish detachment seizes an indigenous village. The very first thing they do after looting is demolish the local shrine, shattering the idols they deem grotesque and demonic. Upon the ruins, they hoist a roughly hewn wooden cross. A priest conducts mass in Latin, a language utterly incomprehensible to the terrified inhabitants who have just been forcibly converted to a new faith. This isn't a dialogue. This is a monologue delivered at the barrel of an arquebus. Yet culture is not merely a building that can be simply torn down and replaced. It lives in language, in customs, in the subconscious mind. And when overt resistance became impossible, indigenous peoples began to wage a cultural guerrilla war. They resorted to a brilliant survival strategy, mimicry, and syncretism. This gave birth to some of the most astonishing and resilient hybrids of the era. The most vivid example is religion. Indigenous communities were compelled to worship Catholic saints, and they complied. But in their minds, Saint James, the formidable horseman and patron of the Conquistadors, merged with their own god of thunder and lightning. The Virgin Mary, Mother of Mercy, absorbed the characteristics of Pachamama, Mother Earth, the ancient Andean deity. The result was something incredible, a two-layered faith. Outwardly, everything appeared canonical. Indigenous peoples prayed devoutly in church, participated in processions, and had their children baptized. But for themselves, they continued to pray to their ancient gods, who now simply wore the masks of Catholic saints. It was akin to installing new Catholic software onto the old, indestructible hardware of the indigenous worldview. And this hybrid faith, Latin American popular Catholicism, proved so remarkably resilient that it endures to this very day, perpetually vexing the Orthodox theologians of the Vatican. This process also spawned biological hybrids. The conquistadors arrived without women. The combination of violence and voluntary unions with local women led to the birth of a new generation, the mestizos. These individuals were living embodiments of the cultural clash. They were neither fully Spanish nor fully indigenous. The blood of both conquerors and conquered flowed within them. Colonial society regarded them with suspicion. They were often outcasts in both worlds. Yet it was precisely these mestizos who ultimately became the foundation for the formation of modern Latin American nations. They were the true, bloody, and tragic product of this particular melting pot. And how did the daily life of the common person, caught in this cultural fault line, change? For them, an entire universe collapsed. Old habits, which had defined every single day, vanished into oblivion. The calendar of rituals and agricultural labors, intricately linked to lunar phases and the movement of constellations, was replaced by the church calendar and the demands of the Spanish overlord. The concept of communal land, where everyone worked together, was obliterated by the introduction of private property. In place of maize and potatoes, which had sustained their ancestors for centuries, new alien crops appeared. Wheat and sugarcane, which they cultivated not for themselves, but for export. Instead of stone axes, steel machetes appeared in their hands. New words entered their language: debt, tax, master. But the most profound and terrifying change was that they ceased to be masters of their own destiny. Their time, their labor, their bodies, and even their souls now belonged to another world. A world that arrived under the banner of El Dorado and brought with it not a golden city, but a total reformatting of reality itself. The conquest of the New World was a war fought on two fronts simultaneously. The first was the tangible, physical battle, where steel and gunpowder crushed flesh and bone. The second was the informational front, where rumors and myths shattered wills and constructed entirely new realities. And the primary weapon on this second front was the myth of El Dorado itself, a legend that didn't simply emerge organically, but was deliberately cultivated. Governors and expedition leaders weren't just victims of this legend, they were its chief producers. Every scrap of rumor brought out of the jungle was inflated to unimaginable proportions. A handful of golden trinkets taken from a captive indigenous person would be paraded for public display as irrefutable proof of the Golden City's imminent proximity. Official reports dispatched to Spain were less factual accounts and more promotional brochures. They meticulously described promising lands, friendly tribes, and unmistakable signs of nearby gold. Meanwhile, the hundreds lost to hunger and disease, the failed excursions, and the pervasive despair were mentioned only in passing, if at all. This was a classic public relations campaign, designed to attract new investors for future expeditions and new recruits ready to fill the ranks of the fallen. Expedition leaders consciously cultivated an aura of chosenness around themselves. They weren't just commanders, they were prophets, leading their flock into a promised land. But for every propaganda campaign, a counter-propaganda inevitably arises. And Spain's adversaries, primarily England and the Netherlands, quickly grasped that the informational battleground was as vital an arena as the Atlantic Ocean itself. They seized upon the real, already monstrous accounts of conquistador brutality and transformed them into a potent weapon, the so-called Black Legend, or Leyenda Negra. Protestant printing presses across Europe began mass-producing pamphlets and books detailing the atrocities committed by Catholic Spaniards in the New World. These texts were often accompanied by gruesome engravings, such as those by Theodore de Bry, which depicted the Spaniards as infernal sadists. Here they are, slowly burning indigenous people alive, there feeding infants to their war dogs, elsewhere torturing chiefs, demanding gold. This propaganda proved incredibly effective. It painted the Spaniard as a singular, absolute evil, a literal demon incarnate. Of course, the English and Dutch weren't exactly championing the rights of indigenous peoples. The Black Legend was a potent geopolitical weapon. First, it morally justified their own colonial expansion. We venture into the New World not to plunder, but to liberate the unfortunate natives from the yoke of Spanish tyrants. Second, it legitimized piracy. In the eyes of the English public, Francis Drake wasn't merely a buccaneer. He was a noble avenger, seizing blood-soaked gold from the Spaniards. The myths forged by their enemies proved so resilient that the stereotype of the Spanish conquistadors' unique, inherent cruelty remains deeply entrenched in the collective consciousness even today. But the most striking illustration of history being written by the victors isn't tied to global politics, but to one particular episode. As Francisco de Orellana embarked on his desperate voyage down the Amazon, his chronicler, the Friar Gaspar de Carvajal, kept a diary. In it, he described a battle against a contingent of fierce, long-haired female warriors who fought in the front lines. As an educated man, Carvajal immediately drew a parallel to ancient myths and dubbed them Amazons. This tale became a sensation across Europe. It imbued Orellana's journey with an epic, heroic grandeur. They didn't just survive, they battled a mythical tribe straight out of legends. So, what most likely happened in reality? Almost all contemporary historians concur that no tribe consisting exclusively of female warriors ever existed. These were ordinary women from a local tribe who, as was often the case, fought alongside their husbands, defending their homes and children from what they perceived as monstrous invaders. Or perhaps they were long-haired men whom the Spanish, in the heat of battle, mistook for women. But the official version, penned by the victor, was far more advantageous. It transformed a brutal skirmish with desperate natives into a heroic battle ripped straight from Greek mythology. Propaganda didn't merely distort reality. It erased real people, their courage, their tragedy, and replaced them with a convenient and beautiful myth that glorified the conquerors and forever inscribed a name born of falsehoods onto the history of that mighty river. When Lope de Aguirre's half-rotted brigantines, having navigated thousands of kilometers through a labyrinth of rivers, finally emerged into the briny waters of the Atlantic Ocean, the mutineers faced an existential choice. The green hell was behind them. El Dorado remained elusive. Their original plan, however insane, had failed. Now, they could have attempted to find a secluded island, establish a colony, and begin building the very independent kingdom they had envisioned. They could have tried to bring their rebellious vision to fruition. But Aguirre made a different, fatal decision. He steered his ships not toward freedom, but toward vengeance. He set course for the nearest bastion of civilization, the Spanish island of Margarita, not to build, but to plunder and destroy. At that moment, the original vision became irreversibly twisted. The very goal Aguirre had used to entice his men, the creation of a new free empire, was betrayed by him. It proved to be just another lie, another tool for retaining power. The means, violence, plunder, terror ceased to be a path to an end. They became an end in themselves. The quest for freedom devolved into a mere pirate raid. The Grand Rebellion degenerated into common brigandage. Aguirre understood that building was far more arduous than destroying, and he chose the easy path. He betrayed not the king he despised, but his own dream. This decision caused a profound rift among his followers. Among his Marañones, as they called themselves, there still harbored individuals who genuinely believed in the vision of a new kingdom. These were seasoned veterans who yearned to become new aristocrats, to claim land and titles. For them, the assault on Margarita was an unthinkable disgrace. In their minds, it looked like this: "We are the founders of a new dynasty, not a band of common cutthroats. We defied the king to become kings ourselves, not to plunder petty merchants and torch fishing shacks." This murmur of idealists, the last torchbearers of the original vision, became a mortal threat to Aguirre. He saw in their longing for honor and grandeur a dangerous resurgence of the old world, a world he had sought to extinguish within himself and within them. The new world Aguirre was forging bore no resemblance to empires or crowns. It was a realm of pure nihilism, where the sole virtue was loyalty to him, the prophet of chaos. And he responded to this internal rebellion in the only way he knew how, with a total purge. The last of his companions who still dared to dream of anything beyond mere survival were declared traitors and ruthlessly executed. The brutal reality of bloody terror ultimately devoured the last vestiges of the romantic dream of freedom. The symbolic act that marked this definitive turning point wasn't merely the conquest of Margarita. It was a methodical, demonstrative annihilation of all attributes of order. Upon seizing the island, Aguirre's first command was to hang the governor and all royal officials. Next, he incinerated the city archives, along with all legal documents, land deeds, promissory notes, and court rulings. This was no senseless barbarity. This was a ritual. He wasn't merely killing people and burning paper. He was eradicating the very concepts of law, property, and legitimate authority. He was showing his people and the entire world that his rebellion wasn't a transition from one authority to another, but a descent into utter lawlessness. In the flames that consumed the parchments, the final remnants of the initial vision perished. The rebel who had dreamed of a crown died. In his stead, a demon of destruction was born, sailing from one port to another, bringing not a new idea, but only plague and devastation. This was the second, and this time, definitive point of no return. The collapse of Aguirre's expedition and his exemplary execution, his body dismembered, with parts sent to various cities as a grim warning, drew a stark and bloody line under an entire era. A society that had endured such a shock could never be the same again. An elite shift occurred. It was not the warriors who triumphed, but the jurists. The heroic age of the Conquistador pioneer, that adventurer who was at once a general, a governor, and a businessman, had irrevocably passed. Men like Aguirre proved to the crown that they were too independent, too ambitious, and too dangerous. They were replaced by a new caste, the faceless colonial officials, the letrados, men in robes dispatched from Spain. Their weapons were not swords, but seals and official parchment. Their mission was not to conquer, but to administrate, not to explore, but to control. The old aristocracy of the sword yielded to a new aristocracy of bureaucracy. The Wild West of the New World had ended. The era of total state control had begun. The economy, too, was irrevocably reshaped. The relentless pursuit of the mythical El Dorado proved to be a colossal failure in terms of investment. Thousands of lives and millions of pesos were quite literally swallowed by the Amazonian swamps. This experience instilled a bitter pragmatism in the colonists. Capital ceased to flow into risky, dead-end expeditions and instead shifted towards more reliable and predictable sectors. The true El Dorado wasn't golden cities, but fertile lands, and most tragically, the cheap labor of the indigenous population. An economy built on the backs of Native Americans, forced into the encomienda system, essentially legalized slavery, began to yield stable and immense profits. The centers of power were no longer the temporary camps of adventurers, but vast haciendas and the silver mines of Potosi. Wealth was no longer synonymous with sudden luck and plunder. It became the fruit of methodical, ruthless exploitation of both land and people. Aguirre's rebellion also made its mark on the economic landscape. His swift seizure of Margarita Island and the devastation of the coastline laid bare the profound vulnerability of the entire colonial infrastructure. In response, the Crown launched a massive militarization program. Trade routes were placed under the protection of the naval fleet. Formidable stone forts, which still impress us today, were erected in key ports like Cartagena and Havana. The free trade and piratical enterprises of the early era gave way to a rigidly regulated system of silver fleets, which traversed the Atlantic under military escort. Security came at a steep price, and these expenditures weighed heavily on the colonial treasury, leading in turn to increased taxes and an even tighter grip from the authorities. But the most profound changes occurred in the psychology of the survivors. For colonial society, the story of Lope de Aguirre became a collective trauma and its greatest bogeyman. His name became synonymous with betrayal, madness, and satanic pride. Any manifestation of defiance against authority, any criticism of the king or the church, was now immediately associated with Aguirre's sin. The Crown acquired a perfect tool for suppressing any dissent. Remember Aguirre. This unspoken threat hung in the air, compelling people to be loyal out of fear of the chaos he personified. This collective trauma birthed a society built on fear and distrust. Conspiracies and rebellions were imagined everywhere. A system of informers became a way of life. The free-spirited atmosphere of the first decades of conquest was replaced by a suffocating air of suspicion and conformity. The myth of El Dorado, once a symbol of boundless opportunity and heroic dreams, now took on a dark hue. It became a reminder not only of untold treasures, but also of the madness they could unleash. The dream was poisoned. Ultimately, the society that emerged from this upheaval proved more stable, more organized, but also far less free. It traded a heroic yet anarchic impulse for a safe but suffocating existence under the heel of a bureaucratic machine. The irony of history was that Aguirre, who fought against the king's tyranny in the name of absolute freedom, only helped that tyranny become even more absolute and pervasive through his actions. His rebellion freed no one, but forever stripped everyone else of their liberty. Behind every grand adventure and every colossal catastrophe lies not merely greed or ambition, but a powerful idea. An idea that serves as both fuel and moral justification. At the core of the entire El Dorado epic lay a formidable philosophical concept, one that could be termed theocratic imperialism. This was a fusion of three components. First, there was the notion of a divine mandate, rooted in papal bulls that granted the Spanish crown all newly discovered lands for the conversion of pagans to the true faith. Second, there was the Aristotelian conception of natural hierarchy, filtered through medieval scholasticism, where civilized Christians possessed the right and even the duty to govern barbarians. And third, there was a sacred reverence for gold. The gold of the New World wasn't just plunder. In the eyes of the Spanish crown, it was a sacred resource, earmarked to finance the fight against Protestant heresy in Europe and the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean. Thus, overseas plunder and murder transformed into a God-pleasing endeavor, an act of service to Christendom. The intellectual engine that crafted the philosophical software for this system was neither a warrior nor a politician, but a quiet, humanist scholar, the court historian to King Charles V, Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda. He never set foot in the New World, yet it was his writings that provided the conquistadors with an impenetrable intellectual armor. Drawing upon Aristotle's works, Sepúlveda developed the theory of natural slavery. He argued that indigenous peoples were, by their very nature, inferior beings, barbarians incapable of self-governance. Consequently, war against them was a just war, and their subjugation not an act of tyranny, but a benevolent act that introduced them to the benefits of civilization and the true faith. Sepúlveda was the true power behind the throne, whose ideas, articulated in elegant Latin treatises, filtered down through the entire hierarchical ladder. They were quoted by royal jurists, referenced by governors in their decrees, and their simplified versions were preached by priests in makeshift churches. The common soldier, of course, didn't read Sepúlveda, but he absorbed his ideas from the very air of the era. This philosophy provided him with a simple and clear justification for everything he did. He wasn't plundering, but expropriating resources for the fight against the enemies of faith. He wasn't killing, but punishing disobedient barbarians. He was not a marauder, but a missionary with a sword in his hand. Yet this doctrine faced a formidable adversary, and their collision ignited the era's foremost intellectual showdown. That adversary was the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas. Having spent many years in the New World and bearing witness to unspeakable atrocities, he transformed into a fervent champion of the indigenous peoples. His philosophy stood in stark opposition to Sepúlveda's tenets. Las Casas contended that the indigenous peoples were complete human beings, endowed with reason and soul, who had forged sophisticated civilizations. Consequently, waging war against them constituted a mortal sin and a monstrous crime, while forced baptism was nothing short of sacrilege. He asserted that the sole path to their conversion lay in peaceful evangelism and virtuous example. This wasn't merely an academic squabble, it was a fight for the very soul of the empire. Sepúlveda's doctrines became the rallying cry for the party of colonists, landholders, and military men who craved unchecked power and exploitation. Las Casas's arguments, conversely, galvanized humanists and a segment of the clergy who implored the crown to protect the indigenous populace. This ideological struggle manifested directly in realpolitik, leading to the enactment of laws that alternately curtailed and then expanded the colonizers' prerogatives. Indeed, the entire saga of El Dorado serves as the ultimate, most absurd manifestation of Sepulveda's philosophy. The mythical Golden City became the absolute good, the supreme objective that justified absolutely any means. To attain it, countless lives could be sacrificed, both indigenous and Spanish. The madness of Lope de Aguirre proved the logical culmination of this philosophy. A man indoctrinated to believe that any law and any human life were negligible in the pursuit of a higher purpose eventually concluded that he himself was that higher purpose, for whose sake the entire world could be laid to waste. The colossal human-devouring machine set in motion by the El Dorado myth didn't shatter from an external blow. Instead, it choked on its own blood and madness. In the wake of Lope de Aguirre's catastrophe, the Spanish crown realized with dawning horror that the instrument it had forged had spun wildly out of control. The system, originally designed to export chaos into the jungles, began manufacturing it in such prodigious quantities that it threatened to rebound and incinerate the colonies themselves. Official licenses for the quest for El Dorado were issued with increasing rarity and reluctance. No one was willing to pour vast sums of money into an undertaking that, with equal probability, promised either a feverish demise or the rebellion of a deranged tyrant. The grand myth had become toxic. The system began to cannibalize itself. The specter of Aguirre's history repeating proved more potent than centuries of gold lust. But an idea of such immense power could not simply vanish overnight. It began to fragment, and an ugly scramble for its legacy ensued. The magnificent dream that had mobilized armies was picked apart by smaller vultures, each twisting its meaning to their own advantage. The first claimants to this inheritance were petty adventurers and outright swindlers. No longer did they assemble hundreds of soldiers. Their operations scaled down to a dozen or two desperate wretches whom they lured into brief, inevitably doomed forays, only to abscond into the night after pocketing their last coin for supplies. The once grandiose epic had devolved into a cheap street farce. The second, and far more perilous, inheritors of this myth were Spain's adversaries. The English adventurer, poet, and Queen Elizabeth's favorite, Sir Walter Raleigh, seized upon the Spanish myth and weaponized it into a geopolitical tool. He was no naive conquistador. He was a man of the Renaissance, cynical and utterly calculating. In his writings, he expounded upon the empire of Guyana and its capital, Manoa, effectively pilfering and repackaging the El Dorado legend for an English audience. His ambition wasn't merely gold. He dreamt of discovering this city to forge an alliance with its emperor, thereby establishing a formidable anti-Spanish foothold deep within Spain's colonial territories. He dismembered the grand idea, transforming it from a sacred Catholic mission into a distinctly Protestant colonial enterprise. But the most tragic inheritor became the solitary seeker. When the grand expeditions ceased, the myth didn't vanish. It simply went underground, transforming from a collective delirium into a personal, quiet obsession. For centuries thereafter, hundreds of nameless treasure hunters, or guaqueros, ventured into the jungles alone or in small groups, guided by fragments of maps and whispers. They died from snake bites and indigenous arrows, or succumbed to madness born of solitude. The great myth, once capable of moving empires, had shriveled to a feverish gleam in the eyes of a lone prospector panning for sand in an unnamed stream. And yet, this era had its final, tragic hero, the last bearer of that original, grand, and insane idea. That hero was none other than Sir Walter Raleigh. After the death of Queen Elizabeth, he fell from favor, enduring 13 years of imprisonment in the Tower of London. As an old man, he managed to persuade the new king, James I, to release him for one final expedition to the Orinoco in search of his Manoa. This was the last echo of a grand epoch, the final shard of a shattered mirror. The expedition ended in utter disaster. His son was killed in a skirmish with the Spanish, and no gold was found. Upon his return to England, a death sentence awaited him. The Spanish ambassador demanded his head, and King James, eager for peace with Spain, offered Raleigh as a sacrifice. In 1618, on a London scaffold, Sir Walter Raleigh, the last of the titans of the El Dorado era, laid his head upon the block. His execution was not merely the end of one man, it was the symbolic close of an entire age of grand adventures. The last vessel of the dream was extinguished by the cold machinery of the state, and along with his severed head, into the executioner's basket, tumbled the very legend of the Golden City, finally transmuted from a guiding star into a phantom of the past. After Raleigh's execution, the Age of Enlightenment dawned. The world grew more rational, maps more precise. Great powers now warred not for mythical kingdoms, but for tangible trade routes and sugar plantations. The legend of El Dorado didn't die, but it fell into a lethargic slumber. From a geopolitical project that shaped the destinies of thousands, it devolved into folklore. It became a tale spun by sailors in port taverns, a romantic yarn about a lost city, utterly disconnected from the bloody reality of the 16th century. Expedition chronicles, written in sweat and blood, gathered centuries of dust in the archives of Seville and Lisbon, morphing from urgent dispatches into uninteresting historical ephemera. The myth wasn't merely forgotten, it was distorted beyond recognition, transforming from a tragedy into a harmless anecdote. And so it continued for nearly 2 centuries, until, at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries, a man arrived in South America who changed everything. His name was Alexander von Humboldt. He represented a new breed of explorer, the complete antithesis of the Conquistador. His weapons were not a sword and an arquebus, but a barometer, a sextant, and a notebook. He came to the New World not to plunder, but to comprehend. Driven by insatiable scientific curiosity, he retraced the paths of many expeditions, yet he sought not gold, but knowledge, collecting plant specimens, measuring river temperatures, and studying the languages and customs of the indigenous peoples. It was Humboldt who truly rediscovered El Dorado for the world. He was the first with a scientific mind to systematically examine all the primary sources. With German meticulousness, he cross-referenced dozens of chronicles, separating fact from fiction, and upon arriving in Colombia, he definitively proved that the entire legend originated from a Muisca indigenous ritual performed at Lake Guatavita. He performed an intellectual autopsy on the myth, dissected it, and delivered a conclusive verdict. A city of pure gold did not exist. Yet something paradoxical occurred. By publishing the results of his travels in a multi-volume, beautifully illustrated work, written in vibrant and evocative language, Humboldt inadvertently gave the legend a second life. He killed it as a geographical fact, but resurrected it as a potent cultural symbol. His books became bestsellers across Europe and America, and the story of El Dorado, scientifically cleansed of its status as a real objective, became the property of romantics. And this is where the great misreading began. The Romantic era of the 19th century interpreted this story entirely on its own terms. Romantics weren't interested in the cynical social engineering and economics of conquest. They saw El Dorado as a grand metaphor for the human spirit. The Conquistador, in their rendering, ceased to be a brutal mercenary and transformed into a titanic, Byronic hero, consumed by a magnificent dream. His tragic quest became a symbol of humanity's eternal yearning for an unattainable ideal, for the absolute. In Edgar Allan Poe's famous poem, El Dorado, a brave knight spends his life searching for the golden land, and on his deathbed receives counsel from a shadow to seek it beyond the mountains of the moon in the valley of the shadow. The story had transformed into a philosophical parable. The 20th century offered its own, even deeper and darker interpretation. After 2 world wars and the discoveries of Freud, humanity began to view this history through the lens of psychology. Director Werner Herzog, in his brilliant film Aguirre, The Wrath of God, depicted the expedition not as a historical event, but as a journey into the depths of madness. The jungle in his film isn't a geographical space, but a metaphor for the dark, irrational recesses of the human soul. The pursuit of El Dorado became a symbol of the destructive force of the will to power, which, stripped of the restraining frameworks of civilization, ultimately devours itself. Finally, in our present time, the last, ultimate simplification has occurred. Pop culture has transformed El Dorado into a jolly quest. In cartoons, video games, and adventure films, it's merely a lost city of treasure, an exotic locale for finding yet another artifact. All the tragedy, all the blood, all the madness have been washed away and polished to a gleam. The grand and terrifying myth, which for centuries served as a weapon, a subject of philosophical contemplation and psychological inquiry, completed its long journey, becoming a harmless commodity on the shelf of the entertainment supermarket. And here we come full circle. We began this story with the problem confronting the Spanish crown in the 16th century. What to do with thousands of restless, avaricious, and armed men who had become superfluous after the great conquests? The solution was an ingenious trap, the myth of El Dorado, a black hole designed to swallow their ambitions and their lives. Now, let's look at the world today. Are we not facing the same problem, only on a different scale? Millions of restless minds craving swift success, meaning, and recognition. And for them too, their own El Dorados have been created. Only today, these golden cities aren't located beyond the Amazon, but beyond a computer screen. These are virtual worlds where you can become anyone. These are financial pyramids promising wealth without effort. These are radical ideologies offering simple explanations for a complex world and pointing to a clear enemy. The jungles have been replaced by an endless flood of information, and the role of cynical governors is played by faceless algorithms that know precisely which dream to dangle before you, so you'll dive into it head first and never return. The mechanism remains the same. Only the landscape has changed. And herein lies the central, inescapable paradox of this entire saga. The quest for absolute control over human nature through the creation of an artificial dream inevitably births uncontrollable monsters who distort that dream and turn it against its creators. The Spanish crown sought to rid itself of potential rebels, yet its very instrument spawned Lope de Aguirre, the ultimate insurgent, who nearly razed its own colonies to the ground. The system designed to absorb chaos became its primary generator. We witness how this grand myth has undergone a complete life cycle. It was born from a genuine Muisca ritual, transmuted into a lethal weapon, drove hundreds to madness, was buried under the weight of its own failures, then exhumed by science, romanticized by art, dissected by psychology, and finally mummified and put on display for sale by mass culture. From a sacred act, it transformed into a political instrument, then a philosophical metaphor, and ultimately a brand. This 500-year odyssey of one idea compels us to examine our own history and ourselves. We consider ourselves the pinnacle of civilization, armed with critical thinking and access to all the world's information. But have we truly become less vulnerable to beautiful and dangerous fables? Or have we merely learned to mass-produce them, rendering them even more seductive and pervasive? And looking at this 500-year cycle, from the ritualistic gold of the Muisca to the digital gold of our present day, the final crucial question arises. As we craft ever more sophisticated myths to govern ourselves and others, are we truly progressing along a spiral of advancement? Or are we simply running in circles within the confines of the same unchanging human nature, with each new revolution merely making the walls of this golden cage a little wider and the illusion of freedom a little more convincing?